Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Eternal Top Deck series. Today it's time to provide you with my update on one of the more established archetypes, in this case Praxis Midrange. I'm personally not the biggest fan of the archetype at the moment, but other people are succeeding with it on ladder and in tournaments, and it is definitely at least a solid deck if you like that kind of deck, and possibly the best time mid-range deck at the moment. So let's dive right into my current version. Alright, so let's take a look at the deck list. The deck is pretty straightforward at this point. First of all, we still have the Initiative Descent to speed things up, help accelerate into the 3 drops and also into the later game stuff, and helps a bit making the warp of Heart of the Vault a bit more relevant, because you sometimes can warp it a turn earlier where you otherwise couldn't, so it increases the chance you get value out of warp a bit. In terms of units, we have the Initiate, Temple Scribe, just as sort of a filler and something to patch up the early game if you don't have early removal or Initiate. Does a solid job against aggro with the blocking of their like X1s, and against control decks. It's just a random free body that gives you something to do with your power while also pinging away at the opponent a bit. Then we have Dawnwalker. Card got nerfed a bit, but the deck is pretty well set up at supporting it most of the time, so the card is still good. It's not quite as reliable as it used to be, but in the matchups where you really need it, it still is against grindy control decks, for example. It just might take a turn or two longer till you can recure it compared to before. Then we have one of the newer additions, Reliquary Raider, since it got changed. I think the card is a great addition to the deck. The deck makes pretty good use of it with the 8 cheap removal to make sure it can attack early on with Purify and Torch. That's also why I'm running more Xenan Initiation than usually, since Xenan Initiation actually is also pretty decent on this. Attacking down a small opposing unit and drawing a card in the process is really nice. Also, having Initiation on a bigger unit to get rid of a big blocker so you can attack with a Reliquary Raider also helps. Against aggro, it's a great early game blocker, since it blocks a lot of their units, since they have 2 attack, and then just gains you 3 health back in the process, so it's really hard to attack into, even with like 2/2s like Outlaw that bounce off of it. And Displacer is another great way to help Reliquary Raider draw a couple of cards before it gets locked out of combat. Which also brings me to Displacer itself. I think the card is just a better turn 4 play addition than Obelisk in this deck, both because it allows the deck to either gain back some tempo, get some tempo, since we are a mid-range deck, not a late game deck after all, so gaining some momentum, and with like Displacers and Carnosaurs and Heart of the Vault, definitely something the deck is looking for to overwhelm the opponent before it gets too deep into the late game, where you often can't keep up with some of the more late game oriented decks in the game. It even is a decent value play against grindy decks, because if the game goes long, you can just rebuy Temple Scribes, Initiation units, or just Carnosaur and Heart of the Vault to replay them, or even units that have been permafrosted, for example. While Obelisk is just a very tempo negative play that makes your fatties even fatter, which is not that important and is really bad against aggressive decks. And Displacer also provides a solid way to interact both with Aegis as well as weapons, because it actually lets you bounce a unit with a blade on them, for example, or an Inquisitor's blade, getting rid of the weapon and gaining tempo in the process. So I really like Displacer. I think Displacer is much better than Obelisk in this deck overall, and especially in like game 1s. Then we have the typical 4 Sandstorm Titan, not much explanation needed, the heart of any time midrange deck. Then we have Worldbearer Behemoth. That card kind of quickly became part of the heart of most time midrange decks, no matter what the second color is, they at this point often end up running like Dawnwalkers, Titans, Behemoth, maybe even Scribe, and Carnosaur in most variants, no matter what flavor of time midrange. I think the card is a bit overrated, but still pretty solid. The 7 health makes it match up really well on offense and defense with most things. The Overwhelm can also come in handy, although the power ramping part is really not doing that much in that deck, especially without, say, Obelisk or Mystic Ascendant. But that's really not the game that I want to be playing with Praxis Midrange. It, however, helps you sometimes to do more than one thing a turn, or just hit that 6 power or that missing influence for your 6 drops. So it is decent, but the ability, the on attack trigger, is not that impactful or relevant. Then we have the 4 Heart of the Vault, the reason to be Praxis over anything else aside from the good, cheap early game removal, and also the only fire card in the deck aside from the removal in the main deck. Currently, it's just yeah, the power play, the amazing card that swings games pretty quickly and heavily in your favor when you start dropping those. And last but not least, we have Predatory Connoisseur, another pretty strong tempo and power play, just a little more situational because you can get blown out by some ambush stuff, or say fast removal like Death Strike or Annihilate, for example, or Island's Choice. But if you get a successful killer on a medium-sized unit, you're getting a lot of tempo and value from it. I'm only running 3 since I feel like 7 6 drops is a good number between like the behemoths and stuff. Your hands otherwise can get pretty clunky, and Carnosaur is a bit situational, so I'm pretty happy with 3 at the moment. I rather run the 3rd initiation basically than the 4th Carnosaur, simply because initiation became a bit better with like Behemoth and Reliquary Raider in the mix, and making the deck less clunky is definitely worthwhile. Something that I have been trying a bit and I'm not 100% sure how good it is. I was running Trailmakers over Temple Scribes and basically just cut a Seek power for a Force Initiation or a Force Carnosaur at this point, making the deck a bit faster and more explosive, also helping with the colors a bit. But it is a bit worse against sweeper type stuff and hailstorm, and even like hailstorm type sweepers, and it also can backfire in the sense if you have opening hands that heavily rely on initiates and trailmakers and then they get silenced or killed, you might be power crippled. Although, as you can see, I didn't really cut power to fit them other than 1. I basically only cut 1 power while transitioning to 4 trailmakers. So yeah, that's definitely something I could see trying and would consider a reasonable alternative to the Scribes. The Scribes are like tried and true and robust, but they're also a lot slower, but they play better against interaction. Then the power base, pretty straightforward, 12 duels. I feel like the deck can afford the 4 Waystones, given that the Waystone is in the primary color, so they don't hurt your chance of playing Initiate of Descent, since if you have a Waystone and a Seed, you can just play the Waystone to play Initiate of Descent. But if you have Fire Waystones and the Seed, you won't be able to play your Initiate turn 1, for example. So having it in the primary color hurts you a lot less. And 9 Sigils is okay together with the Seeks to make the Seeds reasonably often ready in like past like turn 1 or 2 usually. So it has been okay so far, but I couldn't fault anyone for reducing the amount of Waystones. They are not that necessary, but they can help when under pressure against more aggressive decks, or when like being raised in the air from other like justice-based mid-range decks. However, what I would not recommend at all, especially if you only run 25 power, is to run any monuments in addition to Crests and Seeks. You already basically have 8 depleted sources and 8 conditionally depleted sources, making your power development occasionally already more than slow enough, so I would not add to that. Also 29 actual power outside of the initiates is also not a ton, which is why the Behemoth trigger is a bit more relevant, because sometimes hitting that 6 power is not that easy with 29. So Behemoth and Scribe help a bit there, and Reliquary Raider draws. Or Heart of the Vault draws don't really help, because, you know, it costs 6. But anyway, the power is a bit low. That's the other reason why I would have considered running like 28 plus 8 mana dogs instead of 29 and 4 dogs. Because you can sort of count them as half, so it's like 31-ish power, which is still not that high with this amount of 6 drops. And with the Trailmakers you would get to like virtual 32, which is only the conservative count, because if they are living, you obviously have a lot more power and also faster power, so you are more explosive. So yeah, don't put fire Waystones in here, don't put monuments in here. If you want monuments, you have to cut back on Seek powers or just play more power. Monuments can be good, but yeah, they come at a price. And putting them in the base 25 power when you already have crests is just not reasonable and just gonna make your deck agonizingly clunky and slow. Or no relevant or important enough gain, in my opinion. Just don't be greedy. Make sure your deck operates smoothly and consistently. That's much more important than having that random monument that might sometimes be a better top deck than a regular Sigil in the mid to late game. Especially in a deck that is not meant for the late game, but more for like the mid game. Yeah, I considered Shatterglass Mage over some Behemoth, for example, or just by like shaving a Carnosaur and an initiation for 2 Shatterglass Mage. The point is, really, if you look at it, there's not a whole lot you basically wanna or even have 2 Shatterglass Mage in main decks at the moment, and the more annoying things like Blade you can actually already deal with Carnosaur, initiation, or if they are too big, simply with Blade. So sorry, my mouse was acting up there. So Displacer is doing a much more versatile job right now than Shatterglass Mage is, for example. So yeah, Displacer doing job here. Venom Rider, just too underwhelming. 4-drop that doesn't have immediate impact and dies to torch. It's kind of undersized. The deck has enough ways to deal with stuff between the cheap removal, the bounce from Displacer, and the killer effects and Heart of the Vault triggers that you don't really need the ultimate from Venom Rider for anything. So yeah, Displacer is just a better complementary and utilitarian 4-drop, really. And yeah, I think that covers all the like more common options. I guess one other thing that I have seen is Amber Acolyte over Raider. Amber Acolyte over Raider. Sorry, my mouse is like annoying. Amber Acolyte over Raider and no Seek power, and that's just completely irresponsible and unreasonable, since running 25 base power and 4 initiate with Amber Acolytes is just gonna first of all slow you down a lot by having to play Amber Acolyte. To hit your power you will have plenty of cases where on turn 4 you have to play like Amber Acolyte to play your force power instead of your 4-drop. And the other thing is you will simply, a fair share of the time, just lose games where you are stuck for a couple of turns with 2 power and an Amber Acolyte in hand. Because 25 power is not a good enough percentage to have 3 power all the time. In fact, you probably have 2 power openers roughly 33% of the time, based on how the redraw rule works. and then a fair share of those you will just not draw into a third power for a couple turns, because you only run 25 actual power, so it's not like you have the highest chance of drawing into power, and then you just lose game with your Ember Acolyte in hand. Just don't do that. It's unreasonable. I would recommend running at least 28 or 29 actual power between like power, seek, and favors, cards that you're basically guaranteed to be able to turn into power before putting any 3+ cost power sources in your deck, like Ember Acolyte, to rely on them. That's just, yeah. That's just how consistency and the math works out. It's not a good or consistent thing to do. So I would not recommend imitating these choices from other people. It will be to the detriment of the deck's performance and consistency. Alright, that's it for the deck list, and I think that really covers all the cards that I considered and didn't end up playing that you might see other people playing in the deck that are relevant to discuss. So let's move on to the games as usual. So stay tuned for game 1 in a moment.